Good afternoon. How is everybody today? Thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. We want to thank the Jewish Federation as well for sponsoring this event and getting us Ronnie to speak today. I'm not going to talk too long. Ronnie doesn't like big introductions. So we're going to start off with Ronnie coming up. But we appreciate you being here today. And please introduce Ronnie Bresla.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sure you're all familiar with the saying, if we don't learn from history, we're doomed to repeat it. And it breaks my heart to say that in my lifetime now, I see a reoccurrence of the Holocaust throughout Europe, and yes, right here in America, even, I'm sorry to say, in our legislative body at this time, which is a danger to all of us. So let me take you back to the early 1930s and how Hitler came to power through my story. This, of course, is a map of Europe, and here's Germany right in the center. This is my favorite picture of my mom as she's contemplating her future. Mom, of course, is born in Germany. She's the middle of 3 girls and lived in a rural area in the northern part of Germany called Mielen. This is her as a teenager. Her younger sister, Liesel, my mother, her older sister, Idel, her best friend, Selma. Idel, the older sister, unfortunately, plus her husband, Otto, plus my cousin Helga, and almost all of my family were never able to get out of Germany in time, and they were murdered by the Germans. Now, before Hitler came to power, Mom told me she had a great teenage years. Her friends were Jewish, non-Jewish. They all just palled around together. Now we go to the South, because that's where my dad lived. This, of course, is a World War I uniform. This is my dad, his younger brother, Willie. There was an older brother, Sigbert, and all 3 served in the German army, World War I. Now you notice the Iron Cross, a little bit like our Medal of Honor. And he got that for bravery fighting in France, of course, on the German side. My parents, again before Hitler came to power. Now 1933, and Adolf Hitler becomes the Chancellor of Germany. He never hid his disdain for the Jewish minority, even though we're less than 1% of the German population. The vast majority of Germans adored him. There were huge rallies in his honor. By 1935, the German parliament passed the Nuremberg Laws. Now, their purpose was simply to separate us, the Jewish minority, from the rest of the German people. I'm only going to touch on a few Nuremberg laws that that actually I faced in my life. This, by the way, is our home. We had sort of a dry goods store, our residence, and this was rented out to a German couple. This is our house from a different directive. I was actually born in Stuttgart, which is a much bigger city than we lived much further south from Stuttgart in a small city called Kirchheim unter Teck. Now, in Kirchheim, there were just a handful of Jewish families, so every one of my friends were not Jewish. This, remember, we're going back to the 1930s, was our main street, and I remember shopping with Mom many times on that main street. According to my mother, there were almost daily parades in honor of Adolf Hitler in Kirchheim, where we lived. The first Nuremberg law that touched my life was the one that no non-Jew was permitted to work in a Jewish home. At that time, we had a live-in housekeeper. Her name was Sophie. She and I shared a bedroom, ate a lot of meals together. In short, she was my best friend. And when she was forced to leave our home, well, that was my first heartbreak. Another law. No non-Jew was allowed to shop in a Jewish store. And I remember curled up on the windowsill in front of our large display window watching two members of the Nazi Party in full uniform marching back and forth in front of our front door. Needless to say, that took care of our customers, and Dad had to close his business. Now, this is another store, another Jewish store in Kirchheim, not ours. You see the guard here, here, and that's their front door, and I'm sure they lost their business the same way we did. I mentioned Sophie a few minutes ago, our housekeeper, that's her. Hedwig, she used to take me for walks, that's me. I try to bring something a little bit more cheerful into my story when I can. We have here the holiday of Halloween where kids go from door to door and they get their candy. The Germans liked parades. And Fastnacht was a holiday where a big parade, and some of the women had these big aprons with pouches in them. In the pouch were candies. So when they see someone like me in costume, they'd throw candy. And it was a holiday I liked. This is my kindergarten class. First grade. First day of school, you get this cone filled with candies. And that's the final Nuremberg law that I want to touch on, because to me, it was the most traumatic. That Nuremberg law was no Jewish child was permitted to continue public school. Now, at that point, I was in first grade. And one day, after class, the teacher calls me to her desk and tells me I can't come back to school because I'm a Jew. That was devastating to me, and I just couldn't figure out what was different about me from the rest of the students. I remember wandering out into the schoolyard, and the friends I'd walked to school with that morning, they'd left without me. And the only ones left in the schoolyard were just a handful of young German boys who followed me home, taunting me all the way. But I did have one very best friend, Marianne. She waited for me that terrible day, walked home with me, trying to comfort me. I never saw her after that, and finally gathered my courage and asked Mom, why? Did she also stop playing with me? And Mom explained, when her dad got home from work that night and learned that she had tried to remain my friend, a Jew, he took off his belt and he beat her, making her promise never to play with me again. And after that, of course, my life became very lonely. I had no friends at all, and of course, no school to go to. But so much worse was to happen to German Jews. The next big catastrophe was November 9th and 10th, 1938, Kristallnacht in German, the night of the broken glass in English. That night, we Jews lost all of our civil rights and liberties. 400 synagogues burned to the ground in one night. Older Jewish men in their 80s, 90s, actually dragged from their beds, dumped into lorries, and off to concentration camps. Stores, Jewish stores, broken into. This, of course, is a synagogue and one of the stores. Now, especially young people, stones, and some actually had bricks, and they broke the windows and just walked in and helped themselves to the merchandise. Oh, the police were there, but the purpose of the police was to keep the Jewish owners from going into their own business trying to save their own merchandise. And the fire brigade were there only in case a non-Jewish store would be caught on fire. The Jewish stores were allowed to burn. I think it's pretty safe for me to say that after Kristallnacht, there wasn't a Jewish person in Germany who didn't want to leave the country. Our big problem was where to go. What country would help us? My dad, who can trace his ancestry way back to the 15th century, had in his possession his grandmother's Bible. And on the back pages of the Bible were names and addresses of family members that had emigrated from Germany throughout the years. And he wrote to all of them and finally got just one response from a very, very distant cousin. Lived right here in America, in Philly, in Germantown, Henry Katz. And he wrote my dad that he would help us come to America, but of course these things take time. One day, while my parents were rediscussing the situation and trying to decide of where to go, my dad gets an unexpected phone call from a former classmate. He now owned a travel agency, and he told Dad, I have room for one person on a ship which is going to Cuba. And he wanted to give Dad the opportunity to go. Somebody had just passed. Now, as much as Dad wanted to get out of Germany, he wasn't that keen about leaving Mom and I behind. But it was my mother, in her wisdom, who insisted this unexpected opportunity, take it, leave, get out of Germany, and Dad did. Now, before Dad left, he had to sell our home. Many years later, he explained to me, of course there was somebody in Kirchheim perfectly willing to purchase our house. But the sale never went through because the head of the Gestapo in Kirchheim also wanted our house. So one day he's called into Gestapo headquarters, and they asked him to sign some papers. And as he read them through, he realized he's almost giving our house away. So he protested, and they laughed at him. And they said, so don't sign the papers, but the papers you need to legally leave Germany, we're not going to sign. Well, naturally, Dad signed and left. Now Mom and I were homeless. So we moved back to Stuttgart. We live in here, you'd call it a boarding home. But Mom had already purchased 2 more tickets on another ship bound for Cuba so we could join Dad. Our ship was going to leave June the 1st, 1939. One day, Mom gets a phone call from her travel agent, and he says to her, there's so many German Jews leaving Germany for Cuba, we set up this huge, luxurious liner. It's going to have 8 decks. It's going to hold 1,000 people. And most important, it's going to leave May 13th, 1939. And he wanted to know, would she like to change her reservations? And Mom immediately said, yes. And just as a point of information, the ship we were going to take, June the 1st, that never even left Germany. Therefore, May 13th, 1939, Mom and I boarded a ship in Hamburg, Germany called the St. Louis. In the meantime, in Germany, the situation for the Jews was getting worse, almost on a daily basis. One day, they had passed a decree, and suddenly every Jewish male found himself with a middle name, Israel. And every Jewish female got a middle name, Sarah, which is why I have their passports here. This is Mom's passport. Ellie is her first name, Sarah, courtesy of the German government, and Rudlinger, her last name. I'm together with Mom, but if you look at down here, my father's, Gustav, his first name, Israel Rutlinger, all courtesy of the German government. Now, we started right here in Hamburg, going all the way down till we hit Cuba, and here is the length of time it took until we arrived in Cuba. The ship itself had 8 decks. I was 8 years old at that point. It had 8 decks. It had a large toy room, all kinds of toys and games and books, even a ping pong table. 2 swimming pools, one for non-swimmers. That was me. So there was nothing not to like for an 8-year-old girl. I had a chance to explore 8 different decks, play in the toy room, and swim. And most importantly, Mom had told me we're going to see your dad soon, and I was always a daddy's girl, so I was looking forward to that. A few days before we arrived in Cuba, the captain, who by the way turned into my hero, Gustav Schröder, the German captain, gave a ball for the adults. And I remember sitting on the cot arguing with my mother because I saw her getting dressed. I didn't really know what a ball was, but I knew it had to be some kind of a party, and I couldn't understand why she went and I didn't. And Mom's trying to explain it's for the adults. So she insisted I put on pajamas and go to bed, which I was forced to do. But when she left to attend the ball, I got dressed again. I remember going down a wide corridor. I could already hear the music. It had a big orchestra playing Strauss waltzes. Some of you here might have heard of Strauss waltzes. Most of you probably didn't. And once you hit like the end where the staircase was, and underneath, below, was where the dance was held. And this is Mom dancing at the ball. I hope she had a good time. And it looked to me as a kid that the adults seemed to be cheerful and having, all seemed to be enjoying themselves. After a while it became boring and I went back to bed. But in retrospect, it occurred to me that the reason if the adults did seem to be happy was because they had really escaped what the only term I can think of is hell in Germany for Jews. In a few days, they'd be free in Cuba, where they could continue their life. Our day of arrival in Cuba, I'll never forget. I was very excited because soon we'd be together with my dad, so Mom kept telling me. So the ship itself arrived very early, somewhere around 5 a.m. I remember we had a very early breakfast in the ship's dining room when the loudspeaker beckoned us on deck. And as I looked overboard, I see my dad. He's standing up in this tiny little rowboat, waving up at us. Of course, I'm sure I waved back. Years later, I asked him, "How'd you get here so quickly? The ship just came." He had been so anxious to be with us, his immediate family, that he told me he stood vigil on the shore in Havana throughout the entire night. And the moment that the ship docked, he had paid a Cuban to row him as close to us as he was legally permitted. Then each day I would say to Mom, "So when are we getting off the ship?" And her answer was always the same. "Tomorrow," she would say. Now, for the facts, so you know what's going on. What I forgot to mention was that every passenger had to purchase a legal landing certificate, which was quite costly. And this legal landing certificate was signed by Cuba's Minister of Immigration. And that was our guarantee to enter Cuba. But when we arrived in Cuba, and I'm talking about almost 1,000 German Jews, the Cuban government refused us entry, would not allow us off the ship. So here we were, almost 1,000 German Jews stuck on a ship, not knowing what to do. In the meantime, my hero, our captain, and incidentally, I tell the kids, especially the boys, because I know they're not all tall, everybody has to be tall today, that he happened to be the shortest captain in the German Navy. He was 5'4", the captain. And he was young. He had a young wife and 2 little girls waiting for him in Germany. And now he was getting cablegram after cablegram after cablegram, bring the ship back to Germany since the people can't get off the ship. Also, forgot to mention that following the St. Louis were, I think, 3, positively 2 other ships, all filled with German Jews leaving Germany for Cuba. All of them had purchased the legal landing certificates we had. Now, when the captain of the other ships saw we were stuck in Cuban waters, they turned their ships around, heading back to Germany. It took me almost a year to learn what happened to these ships. We're now talking about thousands of German Jews. And I finally learned, when they got back to Germany, the German government said you lost your citizenship after leaving. And they went to concentration camps, which is what would have happened to us if the captain had taken the orders of the German government and turned the ship around. Instead, according to Mom, he met with the adults and he told them, never will I take this ship back to Germany, regardless of what happens to me. He was exceedingly firm. Instead, he began to send cablegrams to the American government, and I'm sure you know it was the Democratic Franklin Delano Roosevelt who was president at that time, who never responded. Also, I'm not sure if all of you knew that there was a quota from Germany to the US, somewhere around 28,000. By the way, that quota was never filled. Most of the passengers on the ship had very low quota numbers, because in '39 the Germans were quite content with their leader. Mom and I and my father could have legally come to America 2 months later. And you probably remember that Ellis Island was still open in 1939. This story of the St. Louis became worldwide news, even though there wasn't any TV or cell phones or computer. Most people got their news from newspapers and, of course, the radio. It still became worldwide news. This is Dad in Cuba, just getting a briefing. You see, he's not the only one concerned of what was going on with the ship. Years later, Mom's friend, who lives in Switzerland, said, this is a little bit like our Inquirer, the Swiss news. I just want to point out that it became international news, the story of the St. Louis. But nobody seemed to care enough to take any kind of action. So this gives you a bit of the background. So let's go back to the actual ship. Oh, this is my hero, the captain, Gustav Schroeder. One day, this is going back to the ship, I'm playing on deck, and I feel the lurching of the ship, and I realize we're moving. So I rush into Mom's cabin, only to see her lying on her cot, sobbing uncontrollably. I wander up on deck, and there are the adults, the men and women, and their tears are running down their faces. And I'm 8 years old. I don't know very much. I certainly know that my dad's not with us, that he's in Cuba, but that's all I know. I had no clue as to where we were headed. I would have been even more scared if I'd realized the adults had no clue where we were going, and the captain was frantically trying to find a place for us to go to. We passed the Miami coastline so close that every passenger aboard the ship could easily see the shimmering lights of Miami Beach. That's how close to Miami we came. One final cablegram, this is all documented, from Gustav Schroeder to the president, pleading with him to allow the 200 kids aboard the St. Louis sanctuary in America, to which he didn't respond. I personally think he did, but this is just my opinion that I'm sharing with you. Because coming directly from Miami Beach was a U.S. Coast Guard cutter. I remember waving to the captain. I was sure he was here to help us. But the facts were, his orders from the president were get the ship out of American waters pronto, which is what he did. So then we began to circle the Atlantic Ocean. Finally, a Mr. Trooper, who was the head of the Joint Distribution Committee, an organization that helps people in distress, came to our rescue and found 4 countries to take us in: England, Holland, Belgium, and France. And of course, you know your history, you know that Holland, Belgium, and France were overrun by Germans, and unfortunately, not all, of course, but too many of the people on the ship were recaptured. Those in England were all saved. The entire ship went to Antwerp, Belgium. And their mom simply sent a cablegram to my father. It just said we landed safely in Antwerp. That's all that the cablegram meant. Okay. So roughly around 250 of the passengers went to England, and I remember them boarding a much smaller ship, and luckily each and every one of them, I'm happy to say, did survive the trip. Mom and I went to Holland. Holland took in only those with very low quota numbers, and there were 181 of the passengers that went to Holland. I remember boarding a much smaller ship, and as we were gliding along the Dutch coastline, it looked to me like hundreds of people were on a very, very hilly area, were on the hills, and as we passed, they all seemed to be clapping and cheering us on. So to this day, if I see somebody from Holland, I give them an extra big smile, because I still remember, it seemed to me that we were welcomed in Holland through those people. We went to Rotterdam, and in Rotterdam we were put into a detention camp called Rotterdam West. And Mom and I were separated. There's a lot of talk about separating today with the illegals coming into the country. We were separated too. I was put in what they called a children's compound, and Mom was placed in an adult compound. So I rarely saw my mom during that period. But I remember most about the campus. One, I was always hungry. I don't want to imply we weren't fed. We were fed, just not enough food. Second, it was really a filthy camp. There wasn't a blade of grass. There was nothing but dirt and rocks, lots and lots and lots of rocks. And being Holland, a lot of rain, so it was mud and dirt. And we're now jumping to October. We're still stuck in this camp. And Mom had packed for me summer clothes, and it was now getting quite chilly in the camp. The camp was right off the Atlantic Ocean. It had a barbed wire fence around it. It was totally locked. You were totally locked in. There was a guard at the gate. You needed permission if you were going to leave the camp. You couldn't just walk out on your own. But there was an open passage, and that was right the Atlantic Ocean, so you could have walked into the ocean if you chose to. And the winds are just hurling in from that ocean, and I got a severe eye infection, just the rim of the eye, which turned very red, and because it wasn't treated, it turned into a chronic condition. I do remember one good thing. One day, this big truck comes in from Joint, and a lot of clothing spills out the back. And I remember having my eye on this little blue coat, which I wore during the day to keep me warm, and at night to keep me warm. The only other good thing I remember is Mom coming one day with a raw egg. We went to the bathroom. She put on the hot water. Of course, it was lukewarm. The raw egg remained a raw egg. It was the best egg I ever ate. Why? I was hungry. To this day, I like eggs. Anyway, long story short, Dad legally came to America. These are just a few, they're obviously not 181, a few of her personal friends at the camp. She borrowed me for that. My favorite Uncle Willie, he was still in Germany at the time. Later, he and the older brother Sigbert walked illegally to Shanghai, which is a harrowing story in itself. So Dad legally comes to America, no problem, gets to Miami and sends her a cablegram, Mom. Arrived safely in Miami, going to Washington. All we needed were the papers to come to America. The quota number had been up. Not only our quota number, but all 181 could have. And I always feel bad about this. He could have legally come to America if anybody, any organization in the US had cared enough to send them the proper papers, because they were now legally able to come. Then he continues writing that he's then going to Philly to get us an apartment. So I'm thinking he was pretty optimistic. We're stuck in a detention camp and he's getting us an apartment in Philadelphia. So Mom gets the proper papers and permission to leave the camp. She goes to the American consulate and he reads the papers and he tells her, this is the advice from the American consulate in Rotterdam. Wait till the war is over. Now, there was no war at that point, but the adults appeared to know that the Germans would be coming into Holland. They weren't quite sure when. So he's already talking about wait till it's over, the war that hadn't even started. After it's done, then you can go to America, because he's telling her there's no more ships leaving Holland. There's no way for her to get out of Holland. That, of course, even I could see was very bad advice. Luckily for Mom, the person in charge of the camp was called a commander. And she went to him, and again, luckily he was a captain in the Dutch Navy. And he told Mom, it's true, there's no more ships leaving Holland, but why don't you go to Antwerp, to Belgium? There's still ships going to America from Antwerp. I kind of think the American consul also knew that info, just didn't pass it on. So that's what we did. We left the camp, went to Antwerp, Belgium, where we had a wonderful surprise. On the motorcycle, I showed you a picture of Mom's younger sister, Liesel. She and her husband were in Antwerp taking the same ship we were going to take. One sister knew nothing about the other. It was a total, complete coincidence. What had happened, Walter, on Kristallnacht, he had been taken to the Buchenwald concentration camp. And if there's time later and you want to hear about it, I mean, they really had hellholes. And many of these camps were directly in Germany, as was Buchenwald, one of them. There were a lot of satellite camps, hundreds of them around Germany. You don't hear about them. You hear about those in Poland, but there were plenty right there in Germany, not as well known. So when he was able to get out of the camp, they went to Antwerp as we did. And it was just a wonderful coincidence that we were going to take the same ship to the USA. For me, there was an extra dividend in there because my aunt and uncle went first class. We were third class. So each morning I would walk up to first class and have my meals with my aunt and uncle, which was a lot nicer than where Mom was stuck. Anyway, as time passed on, and I was getting pretty surly at this point and barely spoke to Mom, she tried to cheer me up by telling me, very soon we're going to be in America and you'll be with your dad. And this is the same story I got when we left Germany. So I was in the unfortunate position of not believing a word Mom was telling me, knowing things were not under her control, but smart enough not to verbalize my feelings to her. And it wasn't until we finally hit New York Harbor. I'm running down the gangplank. I see my dad running toward me from the shore. I realized she'd been telling me the truth. He picks me up and he twirls me around, and I'm happy. But then I look around New York Harbor. In Europe, everybody moves at a very leisurely pace. And I see people in New York Harbor that seemed to me they were running all over the place. So I got worried and I said, what's going on? Where's everybody rushing to? And my dad just laughs and he says, this is America. And yes, that's true. And I realize how exceedingly lucky I am to be in this wonderful country we call the USA, where we have our freedom. But I caution all of us, in these turbulent turbulent times today that we have to really be vigilant so that we never lose this precious gift called freedom. For we all know freedom is not free. God bless America. That's the great part.
I have a microphone here for questions, if anyone has any for Ronnie. Or comments.
I have a question. When you say quotas, what did you mean by quotas?
You mean coming from Germany to the U.S.? Only that many people were allowed to come.
Oh,
28,000, about 28,000 roughly, was the amount of people coming from, that's all Germans coming to the USA. But what I added was that in 1939, not everybody, but most Germans were very thrilled with the leadership at that time period. And they weren't anxious to leave, which made it easier for those that wanted to leave, like us, to get a much lower quota number, which would allow us to come at an earlier time.
Nice.
You're talking about quotas reminds me that we've had episodes in American history of xenophobia, and this is not just the first time. In the early 19th century with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and then we had the Know Nothings after the Civil War, the Ku Klux Klan, and in 1924, of course, the Immigration Restriction Act, which establishes the quotas. So people are acting as if what's going on now is happening for the first time. And unfortunately, every generation or two in this country, we go through this hatred of immigrants and fear of immigrants. I just had a question that why didn't Cuba want to take you? What was the problem there?
It may have had something to do with the amount of people. We were almost 1,000 people, 950 or something in that area. Because my dad left on about a month prior. No, I'm sorry, about 6 months before we did, with no problem. And I know of other people who went to Cuba. Cuba constantly was taking Jews. So then comes to St. Louis with a large group, and that might have been influenced. Also, they needed or wanted more money, which wasn't forthcoming from the Jewish community at the time that they wanted it. So that coupled together with the other. And also, they didn't have to. It was very clear after a while that nobody was going to punish Cuba. Nobody's pushing them. Well, you said you were going to take them in, do so. In the world, none at all. You know, it's like, I also think it gave Adolf Hitler the go-ahead to go into more serious situations, like the concentration camps came later. When you see that nobody gives a hoot as to what happens to these people, you get to think, well, I can do more. I mean, nobody seems to care, and unfortunately, that was the big problem. I mean, considering that we would have been able to legally come 2 months later, it's hard to understand why FDR wouldn't let us come 2 months earlier. We could have been held in Ellis Island. I mean, I'm just saying, it was open. It would have been a place to put us. But he chose not to respond, and he was sort of actually the leader of the free world. So that sort of really gave it. Those 4 countries, they really had to work hard to get those 4 countries. And the passengers, this is the interesting part to me, were really on a higher echelon. If you were on a lower income and so forth, forget it. You didn't have, everything costs money. So you didn't even have a chance. So most of them were doctors and lawyers. My dad was a businessman. People able to take care of themselves financially. And of course, when we did come to the U.S., there was no aid. Not that Dad ever expected any, but there was no help from either the federal, state, or city government. All they wanted was to live and try to earn their own living. So first couple of years here were very, very, very hard for us, but we did it on our own. So the common denominator was that we were Jews.
Do you think FDR was anti-Semitic? It's a shock because people see him as the great liberal.
Well, I know a lot of Jewish people were fans of FDR.
Right.
It's hard to say. He certainly wasn't pro-Jewish. I mean, it wasn't only that. It was the fact that the railroad tracks were never bombed to Auschwitz. And I remember many years ago talking to a group, before you could get into the school system, you speak to adults, talking about that. And one guy got up and he said, he was all excited. He said to me, he was from the Air Force. He said, first I want you to know I'm not Jewish, but there was a rubber factory about 15 minutes from Auschwitz, which was bombed almost every day, a German rubber factory. So those guys saw what was going on in Auschwitz. And they, according to him, they were willing to bomb Auschwitz on their own time without no payment, just as a goodwill gesture, because they saw what was happening to the people and they felt they wanted to help them. And that was one way of doing it. He said it went all the way up to Eisenhower. I have a feeling from Eisenhower it went to Roosevelt, but he just talked about up to Eisenhower, and they were denied permission to bomb Auschwitz. Now they say, the government, they didn't want to bomb Auschwitz, it was going to kill Jewish people. I knew a half a dozen guys from Auschwitz. And what was my first question? What would you have said if the Americans had bombed? He said, we were praying for it. He said, thousands were dying per day. We were praying that one of the bombs would drop on Auschwitz instead of continuing on to the rubber factory. So I never took that as a good excuse.
Question?
About the countries that would open up for you. It was Argentina one of them, because I do know that the Jewish population in Argentina was large at the time. I mean, they would accept Jewish people.
Some.
In
A lot
the
of-
Dominican Republic, I think.
A lot of them went to Shanghai, which is what my two uncles did. That was open. Shanghai, any Jew could get into. The biggest problem was Palestine. Israel, today, Israel, Palestine. My dad wanted to go to Palestine. Most Jews wanted to go to Palestine. It was the English who had a quota in Palestine, and the Jews could not get in, which is why Israel is so important for Jews that are aware of the story. That's really where they wanted to go. But the English with their quota kept us out of Palestine, because there you would have assumed that every Jew could have come to Palestine and lived there. This is prior to it turning into Israel, but they couldn't. Most others, and also they cut your money in Germany, among other things. Let's say you have $1,000, I'm making this up, $1,000 in the bank, in your checking account. Now you need $500 to pay something. You go to the bank, and they say, your account is closed, the government took over, and you're done. And that's one of the biggest reasons that the German Jews were stuck in Germany. Wherever you went, you had to pay, even just a paper, to send a paper to try to get permission. There had to be money. I don't know the amount, so I'm not going to say something I'm not sure of. But you had to add, money to that. So that was a big problem in addition to everything else. So you really sort of stuck.
Any other questions? Another round of applause for Ronnie.
Yeah, that was. The actuality is that we got an invitation from a mayor. Obviously, he was another. It was way after the war, and it came to me. But Mom was still alive at that point. And I remember thinking to myself, this is an invitation. I'm going to do exactly what she wants. Dad had already passed. So I gave her the invitation, and she looked and read it. Then she took the trash can, which was near her, dumped it, and we never talked about it again. But I ended up marrying a German Jew. Now, I was just 18 at the time, and he had just come from the army, and I had no clue that he was a German Jew. These are not things you talk about. We were going together for almost a year before he looked around my parents' living room, and he was waiting for me, and he sees all these books with German titles. And he's thinking, how come they have German books in this house? So he asked me, how come you have German? I said, well, that's because we came from Germany. And he says, me too. And that was the end of the conversation. Years later, we're married, and he gets an invitation to Düsseldorf, which is where he came from, which is a totally different story. They have a huge Jewish community. He went to a Jewish day school after he was thrown out of public school. And he tells me he's going to go, and it's up to me if I want to join him. So the idea of him going to Europe and me being here, that didn't suit me either. So I made a deal, because a week after in the detention camp, it was called Rotterdam West. A few weeks later, they left, it was really a dump, and they went to Westerberg. If you know the Anne Frank story, you know Anne Frank went to Westerberg. A matter of fact, I just read recently about the St. Louis, and they said the people that came to Holland went to Westerberg. Rotterdam West is already forgotten, but I know it was there, because that's where I went. So I said to him, I'll go with you to Düsseldorf if you go with me to Westerberg, because that's where my friends went. That's where I would have gone, and I wanted to see it. That's what we did. We went to Westerberg. But here's the difference between the Dutch and the Germans. In Germany, I went to Dachau. And Dachau is a city, for those that went. It's surrounded with people. There was no way that you didn't know what was going on in Dachau. Westerberg. You go to Amsterdam, last station, and you walk on a dirt road. We walked almost an hour, didn't meet one person. I kept telling my husband, we're going Rome, what are we doing, what are we doing? And he kept telling me, keep quiet, we're getting there, we're getting there, we're getting there. And after an hour comes this teeny little sign, Westerberg, way outside. So when people in Holland will say to you, where's Westerberg? I believe it, because it's so far out. But if somebody in Dachau would ever say, or Buchenwald and the rest of them, where's this camp? I couldn't believe it, because there's no way you could miss it. That was the difference between what happened in Holland. And you know what happened in Italy? When, the fascist government in Italy, when the Germans came in there to try the Nuremberg laws, they didn't work in Italy. They're telling the Italian people, where's the Jews? And the Italians are saying, Jews? I don't know. We're all Italians. And they had to not use the Nuremberg laws. They gave everything up because the Italian people didn't cooperate with them. But the Germans cooperated, and that's the basic difference between the two countries. It's all about the people. It's all about the people. But somebody should ask about, and I always say this to the kids, about our captain. What happened to Gustav Schröder? Because after all, he really disobeyed. I mean, he was like Schindler's List, if anybody saw it. He had almost 1,000 people. The German government was telling him to bring us back, and he wouldn't. So when he went back to Germany with his staff, actually nothing happened to him. I mean, of course he was fired. He knew he was going to be fired from his job, but he got a lesser job. And during the war, when the German peoples also had their difficulties, during that time, some of the passengers from the St. Louis gave some money that I mean, we had very little, but shared it with him after all the man saved our lives. And there is in Israel, it's called the Avenue of the Righteous, and he is there being honored because he saved almost 1,000 Jews. What happened later was not his doing, but he did everything he could. Unfortunately, there were very few Germans that we can say that about, so it's good to know there's, people are people, you don't know how they're going to react in the situation. Most of them are bystanders and do nothing, and that's not good either. You have to be involved. So that's the reason I really took mostly to the kids, so they understand the importance of freedom and the importance of being involved, in these situations. So